Imagine discovering like a framework that you genuinely believe could change the world.
Right, something totally universal.
Yeah, exactly. A truth so universal that when you travel abroad, complete strangers just welcome you with open arms. They hang on your every word.
But then you bring it home.
Yes. You bring that exact same idea back to your own hometown, to your own religious and cultural community, and they don't just, you know, politely decline it. They actively try to kill you.
It is such a stunning contradiction.
It really is. That is the massive historical paradox of the Apostle Paul.
We tend to assume that if an idea is intrinsically valuable, it'll just naturally be embraced by the people closest to us.
Right.
But Paul's experience proves that even the most profound truth will hit a concrete wall if it isn't, translated to fit the specific architecture of the listener's mind.
Well, welcome, fellow learner, to another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today's mission is to explore exactly how to communicate complex ideas across massive cultural divides.
And we have some really fascinating source material for this.
We do. We're doing this by examining a translated transcript from a Korean YouTube channel called Kenosis. Specifically, it's this incredibly detailed lecture on biblical humanities.
Yeah, it looks at the historical and intellectual strategies of the Apostle Paul.
Right, and not just as a religious figure, but as a masterclass in philosophy, linguistics, and cultural integration.
Mm.
So regardless of your personal beliefs, there is so much to learn here. Okay, let's unpack this. Why was Paul's hometown crowd so fiercely hostile to a message that the rest of the ancient world was eagerly absorbing?
To understand that backlash, we really have to look at the difference between an exclusive truth and a universal truth.
Okay, break that down for me.
So Paul's community, the religious authorities of his background, they were fiercely protecting an exclusive truth. This was a highly specific set of rules and cultural boundary markers that belonged only to them.
Got it, like a VIP club.
Exactly. But Paul took the core concepts of that tradition and translated them into a universal framework. He made it something a complete outsider in Greece or Rome could look at and recognize as valid.
Oh, I see. And his own community just couldn't handle that shift.
Right, because they were entirely trapped in what we call dogma.
Okay, so dogma is one of those words that gets thrown around a lot, usually as an insult, honestly.
Mm.
How is the source defining it in this historical context?
Well, in this context, dogma refers to rigid doctrines that were formed to solve very specific historical crises, and then they get frozen in time long after the crisis has passed.
Give me an example.
The lecture explores the rigid Sabbath laws of Paul's era. Those strict rules were actually developed centuries earlier during the Babylonian exile. That's roughly 300 to 500 years before Paul.
Wow, 500 years.
Yeah. And when you are a conquered people exiled in Babylon, you need severe, non-negotiable cultural boundaries just to survive. You need to maintain your identity.
That makes total sense. It's basically a survival mechanism.
Exactly. But fast forward 500 years, the exile is over. Yet the religious authorities had taken a 500-year-old survival mechanism and solidified it into unchangeable, absolute dogma.
Man, and this isn't just an ancient problem, is it?
Not at all. Many modern institutions, I mean churches, corporations, even scientific communities, do the exact same thing. They fiercely cling to 500-year-old doctrines from the Reformation or, 1,700-year-old dogmas from early councils.
Without ever updating the framework for the modern mind.
Precisely.
It's like running legacy software on a brand new operating system. The core code, the original intent behind those Babylonian survival rules, might have been brilliant for its time.
Absolutely brilliant.
But if you don't update the user interface for the current hardware, the whole system just crashes. People look at the modern output and say, this doesn't work, when really it just hasn't been translated for their current OS.
That is a highly accurate way to look at it. True intellectual engagement with any foundational text requires reinterpretation.
Right. Not throwing that away.
Exactly. Not discarding the old, but actively translating it for the current era. Jesus modeled this constantly.
Oh, right, with the wineskins.
Yes, he told his followers that new wine needs new wineskins, and that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. He was actively challenging the rigid, frozen dogma of his day to recover the original functional intent behind the rules.
But wait, I have to push back on this a little because I could already hear the counter-argument forming. Doesn't reinterpreting a sacred text or any foundational document, like a constitution, risk destroying the original truth entirely?
It's a fair question.
I mean, if you keep rewriting the code to fit every new operating system that comes along, at what point are you just running a completely different program?
Well, what's fascinating here is that the source argues keeping a profound truth alive actually requires translation.
Really? How so?
Reinterpretation isn't destruction. It is the act of uncovering the original intent. If you lock an idea in a 500-year-old linguistic vault, you aren't protecting it, you're suffocating it.
Oh, wow. Becomes a museum piece.
Exactly, rather than a living concept. To ensure the current generation can genuinely understand the core truth, the packaging has to change. And understanding that necessity perfectly sets up Paul's next move.
Which is arguably one of the greatest linguistic pivots in recorded history. Because if reinterpretation is all about translating a truth for a completely new audience, we have to look at how Paul managed to translate his message for the absolute intellectual elites of his day, the ancient Greeks.
Right, and we can see this play out in the city of Ephesus, specifically in the lecture hall of Tyrannus.
Okay, set the scene for us.
Ephesus was a major hub of Hellenistic culture. The Greeks gathering in these halls weren't interested in the historical dogmas or boundary markers of the Middle East. They were philosophers.
So they wanted to argue ideas.
Yes. Their absolute obsession was finding the fundamental principle that governs the entire universe. For centuries, their top philosophical pursuit was identifying the arch, the foundation, or the logos.
The logos, and what does that mean exactly?
It roughly translates to the reason, logic, or underlying organizing principle of all reality.
Okay, so Paul walks into a room full of Greek philosophers who have been endlessly debating this concept of the logos. And instead of, quoting his own historical texts or asking them to learn his cultural history, he listens to their deepest philosophical question.
He meets them exactly where they are.
Yeah. And he gives them a perfectly customized answer. He tells them, that logos you've been searching for, that ultimate principle of reason, it's not just an abstract mathematical concept. The logos is Jesus.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the strategic weight of this is just staggering.
It's brilliant.
By adopting the specific philosophical term logos, Paul didn't ask these Greek intellectuals to join a foreign religion. He told them that he held the final puzzle piece to the exact philosophical equation they had been trying to balance for hundreds of years.
Wow. He validated their centuries-long intellectual search.
Yes, and he provided the culmination of it using their own established vocabulary.
Let me make sure I'm fully grasping this. When we talk about logos Christology, in plain English, it's essentially taking this Greek idea that the universe has a hidden logical code running it. And Paul is saying, yes, it does have a code, but that code has a personality. It's a person.
That is exactly it. He personified their highest intellectual ideal, and it was incredibly effective.
It's the ultimate linguistic hack. It's like discovering the exact search term an entire culture is typing into Google for their deepest existential dread and providing the exact answer using their own keywords.
A perfect analogy.
And this specific framing originated right there with Paul. We usually associate the concept of the logos with the opening of the Gospel of John, which famously says, in the beginning was the Word, or in the original Greek, the logos.
Right, a very famous passage.
But the lecture points out that John wrote that gospel decades later, around the 90s AD, while he was pastoring the very church in Ephesus that Paul had founded. So John was building directly on the intellectual foundation Paul laid in that lecture hall.
To really drive home how necessary this kind of translation is, the Kenosis lecture gives a brilliant historical parallel from much closer to our own time.
Oh yeah, the Korea example.
Yes. When early Western missionaries first arrived in Korea, they faced an identical translation hurdle. What do you call the ultimate divine figure?
Right, because if they had forced the Greek word theos, or the English word God, onto the Korean culture, it would have felt entirely foreign, like an imported, colonizing Western concept.
Exactly. Instead, they looked at the existing culture. They realized that the Korean people already had a traditional concept of a supreme heavenly deity named Hananim.
Hananim, okay.
So the missionaries used that exact name. They said, the divine being we are talking about is Hananim.
And that specific cultural bridge was a massive catalyst, wasn't it?
It was, because they use an existing, deeply respected cultural concept. The movement exploded in Korea. The people felt they were finally understanding the fullness of the ultimate reality they already knew, rather than being forced to adopt a completely alien entity.
Okay, but again, I have to play devil's advocate here. When you use a term like Hananim, which already has its own baggage and history in Korean culture, didn't the missionaries worry they were accidentally validating a completely different religion?
It's a very common fear.
Wasn't there a risk of just blending everything together until the original message was lost?
That is always the tension in cultural translation. But the source argues that the alternative, demanding that a culture adopt your foreign linguistic framework before they can even understand your idea, well, it basically guarantees rejection.
That makes sense.
The genius of using logos or hananim is that you are finding the highest, most noble concept within a culture's existing framework and using it as the bridge. You are saying, you are already looking in the right direction. Let me bring this into sharper focus.
That is so powerful. But this brings us to a massive contradiction that we really need to dig into.
Oh, absolutely.
If the core translating concept that built the foundation of Western thought was logos, which literally means reason, logic, and intellect, then why do so many modern institutions, especially religious ones, tell people to just turn off their brains and believe?
It is a profound irony. The lecture argues fiercely against that anti-intellectual approach. Pitting faith against reason is a fundamental error.
Why is that?
Because logos translates to reason, reason is actually presented as the defining characteristic of the image of God in humanity. It is our specific ability to discern, to critically question, and to judge right from wrong.
Unlike animals.
Right. Animals share our emotional capacities. They feel anger, fear, affection, but the capacity for objective reason, the logos, is uniquely human.
I have to say, for anyone who has ever been in a religious setting or even, a rigid corporate culture and felt guilty simply for asking why, this perspective is incredibly relieving.
It really is.
Your desire to question things isn't a lack of loyalty or a lack of faith. It's the most profound expression of your humanity. But then we have to ask why institutions do this. Why do they demand blind faith?
This raises an important question about the psychology of control and cognitive dissonance. When rigid dogma encounters the complex reality of the real world, it creates friction.
Right, it doesn't fit anymore.
And for an individual, noticing that friction, noticing that the 500-year-old rule doesn't make sense anymore, creates cognitive dissonance, which is psychologically painful. Healthy systems resolve that pain by using reason to reinterpret the rules.
And unhealthy systems.
Unhealthy systems like cults use fear to short-circuit the logos. The speaker points out that cults thrive on intense, manipulated emotional experiences, but they purposefully isolate their followers from rational synthesis.
They don't want you thinking.
Exactly. They tell you that any doubt, any critical questioning is a betrayal of the group. They force you to bypass your reasoning center to maintain control. But within this theological framework we are discussing, the divine method is the exact opposite. It actively invites rigorous questioning.
The story of doubting Thomas is the perfect example of this, isn't it? Thomas hears that Jesus is resurrected, and he essentially says, I need empirical evidence. I'm not just going to take your word for it.
Right.
And when Jesus actually appears, he doesn't scold Thomas for lacking blind faith. He doesn't say, shame on you for not just believing.
No, not at all. He actually invites Thomas's reason and his physical senses into the process. He tells him to look at the wounds, to physically touch them.
Wow.
He provides the raw data Thomas needs to rationally synthesize the miraculous event.
So if questioning and reality testing are these vital celebrated traits, human institutions are terrified of them because reason inherently decentralizes control.
That's the crux of it.
Once you encourage people to use their logos, their critical intellect, they inevitably notice when the legacy software is buying. When you tell young people or intellectuals, don't ask questions, just believe, you don't save their faith, you drive them away entirely.
Which is exactly what the lecture says we've seen accelerating since the Enlightenment. When faith is divorced from reason, it becomes entirely unsustainable for the thinking mind. True intellectual growth requires holding subjective emotional experience and critical reasoning in a constant active tension.
So what does this all mean for the person who actually built this framework? How did Paul apply this rigorous questioning to his own life? Because, Paul didn't start as a philosopher in a lecture hall.
No, definitely not.
He started with an intense, mind-bending, subjective, mystical experience on the road to Damascus, the blinding light. How do you get from a blinding light to a structured philosophy?
This is a crucial piece of the puzzle. After Paul had that dramatic vision, he didn't immediately run into the nearest city square and start writing doctrines. He didn't just scream his subjective experience from the rooftops.
What did he do?
He disappeared. He spent over a decade, more than 10 years, in his hometown of Tarsus and in the desert, quietly processing what had happened to him.
Over a decade. In today's culture, if someone has a profound experience, they launch a podcast and write a best-selling memoir about it by Tuesday.
Right.
But Paul took 10 years. How do you even process something like that for a decade?
The lecture compares it to essentially using the scientific method of theology. Think about how a scientist operates. First, there's an observation of a phenomenon.
Okay.
Then the scientist forms a subjective hypothesis. Next comes the experiment phase, rigorous testing to see if the hypothesis holds up under pressure. And finally, if the results can be repeatedly verified, it becomes an objective theory.
Okay, observation, hypothesis, experiment, objective theory. But how do you actually experiment on a spiritual vision in the first century? You can't put a vision in a petri dish.
You experiment by trying to break your own hypothesis. Paul had his initial spiritual experience, the observation. Then, instead of just trusting his highly subjective feelings, he moved into objective questioning.
So he tested it.
Extensively, he took that emotional high and tested it against reality. He spent years cross-referencing his vision with centuries of dense Hebrew texts. He would have debated local scholars, looking for logical inconsistencies in his own thinking.
That's fascinating.
He tested the logic of his subjective vision against the objective reality of human suffering, community dynamics, and historical tradition to ensure he wasn't simply suffering from a personal delusion.
He essentially peer-reviewed his own mystical experience for 10 years.
Precisely. Only after that grueling experimental phase did he emerge with a theology. He took raw, chaotic data and subjected it to the fire of reason. He built a philosophical architecture so sturdy that it could withstand the intense scrutiny of the Greek elites.
And that's why it spread.
Exactly. Because of this incredibly rigorous intellectual framework, many secular historians and anthropologists actually point to Paul as the true operational founder of Christianity. He built the system that allowed the ideas to travel.
But before we get too carried away with Paul's specific framework, there is a really vital piece of humility to introduce here that the source touches on. The classic analogy of the blind man and the elephant.
Oh, right.
Where one man feels the trunk and says an elephant is like a snake, another feels the leg and says it's like a tree, another feels the ear and says it's like a fan. Paul's Logos Christology, as brilliant and world-changing as it was, is still just one facet.
Right, it's not the whole picture.
It's one side of a four-sided view of Jesus presented in the historical text. It's the intellectual, philosophical side.
It is a vital reminder that even the most brilliant cultural translation is still only capturing a portion of the whole truth. Knowledge is truly valuable when it is understood and applied within a specific context, but we must never make the mistake of thinking our one translated angle is the entire elephant. Paul used reason to build a bridge into the Roman Empire, but he was still only pointing toward a mystery that is larger than any single philosophical system.
Which brings us right back to you, the learner. We've covered ancient Greeks, Korean missionaries, the psychology of cults, and the scientific method of theology. But the core tension here applies to almost every aspect of human endeavor.
It really does.
Whether you are dealing with a personal philosophy, trying to pivot a corporate business strategy, or trying to communicate a breakthrough in your field, you have to look at your own operating system. Ask yourself, are you stubbornly clinging to an outdated dogma just because it's a survival mechanism from a past crisis?
Or are you willing to do the hard, necessary work of reinterpreting and translating your core truths for today's audience?
Exactly. Are you shutting down your reason, your Logos, just to conform to an institution? Or are you rigorously testing your own experiences?
The greatest ideas in human history are rarely born fully formed from a single flash of inspiration. They are forged in the fires of intense, long-term critical thinking. They only survive if someone is willing to do the grueling work of translation.
And that leaves us with one final provocative thought to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive. Paul looked at the ancient Greeks and realized they were obsessed with finding the Logos. So he used that specific philosophical key to open the door to their culture.
And a century ago, missionaries realized that the Korean culture had a deep reverence for Hanunam, and they used that linguistic bridge to change the landscape of the country.
So think about the world we live in right now. If you were tasked with translating a profound, universal truth to the hyper-connected, AI-driven, algorithm-obsessed, deeply anxious world of 2020 psychs, what would be our culture's Logos?
What is the ultimate buzzword, the core existential concept that we are all desperately searching for today?
What is the missing code that fits the lock of the modern mind? Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep translating, and we'll see you next time.